One of the most controversial changes coming in Midnight is the complexity prune, with player opinion being split down either side of the often radical changes being applied to specs. Some of you might have seen my previous video in May surrounding this topic, where I raised a few alarm bells about just how complex spec design had become before Midnight coverage had even begun. Now that Blizzard appears to have reached a similar conclusion, I want to examine how they tried to solve the issue, because if it lands wrong, Midnight might be in for a rough launch. First, let's make sure we're all on the same page. To avoid some previous confusion from my last video, let me restate a key point clearly. A spec being complex is not the same as it being difficult. You can have a very easy spec that's incredibly hard to understand because of complexity within its mechanics and talent tree, and conversely, you can have a very difficult spec that has a talent tree that lays it all out to you. I think the design philosophy changes still allow the latter to exist, which is great, I really want that, but Blizzard should be targeting the former for modernization. The simple fact is, add-ons are going away in Midnight. Regardless of how you feel about their removal, it's happening, and that directly leads to extra design challenges for specs compared to the War Within. Without WeChorus to distill information and make it passable, the onus is on Blizzard to make sure all specs communicate their end goals in-game clearly. These constraints put an extra burden on the dev team, because if that fails, specs become less fun. It becomes unrealistic to pilot them correctly, let alone get feedback on how your execution is without using external tools. With that out the way, I'm going to go through a few case studies about how they've approached the prune. To make it clear, I think there's a lot more hits than misses, but some of these misses seem catastrophic, and they need addressing sooner rather than later. Due to the large variety of specs, it means they can't all be approached with the same tool. Some needed a Sledgehammer, they'd ballooned outward to such a degree that a rebuild was necessary to tighten the loop back up, and others needed a Scalpel. Only a few things were really out of bounds, so a little tightening would achieve the modernization goals. Many specs had the correct tool applied, and I'll cover successes with both the Sledgehammer and the Scalpel, but then there's Fire Mage, and I'll get to that one later. In this section, I'm only going to be looking at the combat gameplay loop and how that's being reimagined for a few specs. The defensive and utility changes are an entirely separate can of worms I won't be opening, because that's a bit more of a meta discussion. The first should come as no surprise, which is Enhancement, one of the clearest examples of a spec that needed the Sledgehammer, or, well, the Doomhammer approach. While many, myself included, did enjoy the way the spec's been designed over the years, it's also abundantly clear a lot of the wide community found the spec extremely difficult to unpack and approach, and it's quite easy to see why. Within the scope of Midnight's changes, I fully agree that Enhancement's prior design mantra was unsustainable, and it was a core reason I called out the complexity creep in the War Within. As a design case study, Enhancement is a very interesting and unique one, so let's start with the core that required that simplification. The fundamentals of the spec run side by side with Builder Spender, but far more of the underlying flow relies on access to abilities with no cost, so the economy has to be built around their cooldowns. This has been solved and iterated on in so many ways over the years, but the state in the War Within got a bit extreme, because it simultaneously used multiple separate solutions at once. Almost every ability had some form of cooldown reduction or reset effect. Some even had 2, or in some cases 3, with many additional components tacked on. This can be a lot to parse even for very experienced players, so I can only imagine how difficult it is working out whether Storm Surge procs, Stormblast extra charges, or Legacy of the Frostwitch resets are the important part of stabilizing your access to Stormstrike all on your own. This isn't unique to Stormstrike either. When playing Totemic, you have to tease out the impact of Molten Assault's flat cooldown reduction, Ashen Catalyst's ticking CDR, and Hot Hand's dynamic burst procs to actually reach the answer to the question the spec poses: can I hit Lava Lash enough? This is before we even move into the Spender economy. At which point do you have too many active buttons to juggle with your active GCDs between Stormstrike, Lava Lash, Ice Strike, and your shocks? These are all very complex questions surrounding what is, at its very core, a relatively simple combat loop. Press buttons when they're available and spend your Maelstrom weapon. Which of these buttons actually matter, or do any of them matter at all, and has it shifted solely to being about spenders? The point at which these shifts happen are so amorphous and spread so thin across a variety of talents that pinpointing the playstyle is difficult to divine with complex theory crafting tools. How can Dave the Delver work out how things are supposed to work without being forced into external guides? Compound that complexity in building your character on the talent tree with the nightmare that's tracking all of the effects in a combat environment. On live servers, you need to track your Maelstrom spent toward Tempest, which can only be done with WeChorus because there's no UI support, your Awakening Storm's progress, your tier set progress, and your Maelstrom weapon, and personally I don't count Blizzard's old power auras as fit for purpose for something that important. That's before we even reach the tracking of basic ability cooldowns, longer cooldowns with CDR like Feral Spirit, or procs like Voltaic Blaze. Having a dynamic rotation that fluctuates is one of the best parts of World of Warcraft's combat system compared to other MMOs, but there's also a point that could be too much. There's even more questions that constantly popped up on Discord throughout the expansion that I don't even have time to cover. Almost every single ability had some component that lacked clarity of purpose, and I think that was the problem that Midnight is aiming to solve. Enhancement's reimagining in Midnight is, I think, a masterclass in streamlining. The structure is far more signposted, and how you're supposed to navigate combat is far clearer, but very little in terms of execution complexity was lost along the way. What it revealed was that you didn't need a laundry list of extra abilities to manufacture synergistic aha moments in the rotation. You just needed a core amount that had clear, valuable purpose with each press, and you create the same feeling. The biggest of these is Maelstrom Weapon. Giving it a facelift by consolidating all those tertiary reset effects into a singular effect that provides granular access from spenders using elemental tempo elevates it to the place that it should be, the cornerstone of the rotation. Gone is the lack of signposting about whether spenders are even worth it. The question is back to where it was at its most healthy in the past. When is the best time to slot it in between Stormstrike and Lava Lash? This makes the tree easy to navigate, and combat flow is far more intuitive out the box. You only need to spend a few minutes to realize that if you don't manage your resources and straight cooldowns effectively, you run out of buttons to press. A feeling visceral enough that you know you made the wrong choice, and the tree makes sure that you can see how to solve it. Redundant extra filler GCDs are simply gone, consolidated instead into Voltaic Blaze, and it's an active button that solves multiple problems on its own. There's no mixed signals like the live iteration, which is a big win for approachability. Gone are talents and decisions that induce unnecessary friction, like, say, Totemic's lack of a strong Maelstrom weapon linking. Totemic Momentum solves that by doubling down on elemental tempo's importance by using it as a way to drive Hot Hand. The tree hands you the tools to solve the problem without playing a game of find the talent in the haystack. It's not all perfect though, don't get me wrong. Converting Tempest into a random proc to eliminate needing to implement a tracking aura for Tempest progress is a pretty weak solution, especially because the rest of the tree has almost lost all of its interesting hooks going in the process. Even with that negative though, that's a much easier problem for the dev team to solve compared to still requiring a fundamental rework to pull apart arcane synergies and hidden ability value. I cannot stress enough just how unrealistic executing the war within iteration would be with UI restrictions, nor how limited design clearly was. Too busy trying to patch up holes rather than right the ship. While the transition to a new design may be painful, I think what's been done stands as an example of not only using the right tool for the job, but identifying what makes the spec tick and what parts were necessary to creating that feeling. That brings me to the next spec that achieved a similar result, but it used the Scalpel instead. Havoc is an example of how a spec should be approached when it isn't built on an overly complex foundation. While it rewards high execution, meaning it can often be quite difficult to pull off, none of its core components are complex or hidden in obscure corners of the talent tree. In a word, the tree is honest. It has clear-cut goals throughout combat already, and the difficulty comes down to how well you can apply these clear principles in a given encounter. With Midnight then, instead of knocking it all down and rebuilding, the parts that did cause friction both in build choices and in execution were delicately reshaped. The prime example of this was Essence Break. Previously a multiplier that compounded the power of Blade Dance and Chaos Strike, that meant that it overwhelmingly telegraphed that you needed to layer as much power into the short window as possible. This in turn meant that any time drifting cooldowns, especially with the variable CDR and I-beam from Cycle of Hatred, would pose the question, do I cast a bad one now, or do I hold it and realign things later? While the answer is known for theory crafters, having a question that's so difficult to just know the answer to for the average player is a key point of friction that taints an otherwise very open design. Instead, converting it to flat damage bonuses achieves the same gameplay goal without the potential question mark appearing. Almost everything else done to Havoc throughout the Midnight redesign to fit Devourer into the class tree was a combination of cosmetic changes and signposting. Moving key talents and gameplay goals into central points of the tree that compound simply reinforcing rules like press I-beam on cooldown, while merging Chaotic Transformation and Inner Demon into a choice node, removing some of that tension from its launch sequence-esque openers. If you lifted Midnight's Havoc and placed it on live servers right now, I doubt many would find much of a difference in the War Within landscape, and that stands as testament to how subtle yet effective the modernization is. It's also proof that if a spec already fits the stated goals to make it easier to parse without additional UI support, then there's no need to enact change for change's sake just because Midnight is removing them elsewhere. On the other hand, sometimes specs still require that Scalpel, but the degree of surgery needed is a bit more precise to keep the essence intact. Feral is one such case that's very unique in Midnight, because it almost entirely hinges on how well the UI updates integrate with their design changes. It also, like Enhancement, had a tracking issue to tackle, but unlike Enhancement, The issue stemmed from a mechanic so fundamental that it had to be tackled head-on using handmade solutions. The spec's deepest core mechanics have always revolved around the idea of snapshotting bleeds, something that is fundamentally opposed to a world where the game wants to telegraph what to do without the use of computational tracking auras. That creates a dilemma. How do we retain something that requires advanced, bespoke tracking tools without the community-created tools to solve it? The current design, I think, makes it clear that their intention of retaining execution, but removing the burden of complex and often muddy decision-making. While Blood Talons is a staple of the spec, and has been for a long time, and I personally really like it, having the triple threat of Pouncing Strikes, Blood Talons, and Tiger's Fury, plus Moment of Clarity for Thrash, mandated a way to track different modifiers simultaneously. Tracking auras were often used to effectively grant you permission to refresh bleeds, rather than being something you could intuit with in-game information. Instead, Midnight removed tertiary snapshotting effects and put the onus exclusively on Tiger's Fury. This is used as the primary driver for snapshotting empowered bleeds, and in turn, this came with a unique UI solution. The tooltip icons for Rake, Thrash, and Rip dynamically changed to empowered versions to indicate you can snapshot a stronger effect, which will also carry over to the debuff icon applied to targets. This gives a clear directive. Use Tiger's Fury to empower your bleeds. No grey areas with secondary snapshotting effects or confusing talents. With those changes opening the doors for Blood Talons to be removed, abilities like Brutal Slash that often just existed as your third generator in the sequence could go as well, and replaced with more explicit tools. Chomp is one such addition, carrying over the spirit of Blood Talons by having you dump energy aggressively to enable its use for their big payoff. It's also something I personally think they should lean into a little bit further with the rest of the tree, but that's a bit of a tangent. Likewise, adding in nodes such as Focus Frenzy to allow Feral Frenzy's cooldown with Tiger's Fury clears up a common issue of whether it should be held for these windows. It now just does it naturally when you take the talent. These are all changes that on the surface seem quite drastic. A core mechanic is having key components ripped out. In reality, though, this means the exact same loop is present, almost with surgical precision, but friction and confusion on what matters, when it matters, or if it matters at all is gone. Things are signposted to be important. Feral is a case of design doing everything it can to preserve the core, despite a pretty challenging transition. The onus is with the UI team to make sure that tracking is realistic, but the work has been done to set that up and reduce the complexity and friction while retaining all of the execution hallmarks the spec has always had, with a relatively similar flow to live. With that, it brings me to my final case. I've established 3 beforehand that were examples of different solutions being applied to different problems appropriately, but I can't ignore the elephant in the room. Let me be clear, I'm not anti-complexity reduction, but I am pro-diagnosing the correct problem and keeping specs engaging in the process. Fire is a clear case of missing the forest for the trees and burning the entire place down in the process. Fire's offensive toolkit in the War Within is one that's eerily similar to Havoc, quite lean with the number of active buttons, often with a lot of compounding effects tacked onto each button to give a clear direction on their purpose. Importantly though, it did have one explicit complexity-related issue to tackle, much like Feral, overlapping CDR effects often being active, dynamic, and punishing in relation to combustion. This led to extreme uptime, provided you knew in advance how to navigate an encounter, where combustion would land, and how to execute a fairly precise sequence that added a lot of mental overhead in key moments. This also likely limited how much power designers could put into high-octane cooldown moments when it's available so frequently, especially if the punishment for misplaying is becoming too high. One of the most visceral components to how Fire feels when playing is combustion itself. It's a cooldown that by design turns you into a machine gun, so any design changes would surely identify that maintaining that feeling was key, right? Well, in the case of Midnight, it's not, and it's one of the worst casualties for it. Before diving into a full breakdown of the specs Midnight offering though, it's worth considering Blizzard's stated intent on the initial blue post that I've put on screen. The key takeaways are the segments underlined. This clarifies them understanding that same fundamental issue that held Fire back, much like Feral's. Pyroblast access was so high that it couldn't be tuned in a way to feel like a payoff moment. It even goes as far as to address the key issue directly. Combustion's variable CDR in high uptime was the cause, but after addressing this and the talent restructuring, they went beyond that scope and caused collateral damage to the entire toolkit. To reach the core of just how much was lost with Fire though, we have to start right at the beginning with the action bar and button count. I think, personally, there's a bare minimum number of rotational buttons that any modern spec needs. With too few, you risk every talent or proc hooking into the same 2 to 3 abilities, either overloading them with complexity or requiring everything to be passive to avoid rocking the boat too much. Having enough buttons available in the core rotation to provide breathing room allows designers to distribute rotational variety while avoiding placing all the burden on singular abilities to carry the entire package. In the War Within, a single target core consisted of 5 abilities. It was Fireball, Fire Blast, Pyroblast, Phoenix Flames, and Scorch. There was some overlap in function, but they all served a purpose. In Midnight, this has been cut down to just 3, Pyroblast, Fireball, and Fireblast. And you can feel how out of sync the design is compared to both its sister specs in Arcane and Frost. It's placed all of the onus on Hot Streak to carry the gameplay for the majority of the time, and while it's an iconic mechanic, I don't think you can produce a rewarding, engaging combat experience with one mechanic alone. This was a cull, not a trim. These cuts also had a major impact on combat flow and the talent tree. Cutting Scorch lost a flexible, fast alternative to Fireball that could be used on the move. Fire is now locked to long Fireball casts throughout combat and relying on Hot Streak to stay mobile. Scorch was already telegraphed as your tool for exactly this, and had dual purpose with the talent tree in the War Within as an execute tool for guaranteed crits. This is a clear example of something that was already telegraphed well, but was removed anyway. Phoenix Flames went the same way, and while this did overlap with Fire Blast to some degree, it was key to navigating your combustion windows in that machine gun fashion. This double tap of removals, alongside shifting everything over to Fireball, a much slower cast, might I remind you, is a complete departure from the playstyle that the spec has operated on for years. They also had the opportunity to take a leaf out of Arcane or Frost's book with Touch of the Magi and Frozen Orb, using Meteor as that mid-range decision point cooldown in the rotation. Instead, it simply occupies 3 talent points on the tree for a press-on cooldown, does damage. All of the rotational tuning knobs that previously existed on the tree instead have been consolidated purely into Fireball, Fireblast, and Pyroblast. Specifically for Fireblast, there's now 3 separate cooldown reduction effects, fired up from the Ashes and Fiery Rush, to try and make up for what Phoenix Flames was doing before. This is the inverse of how Enhancement solved the problem of confusing overlapping talent effects. Instead, Fire doubled down on it, and I didn't even list all of them. This removed the button, replaced it with higher cognitive load CDR management, and it's buried in a variety of talents, requiring you to sequence your most important burst window even more precisely. Fireball, on the other hand, absorbs Scorch's movement speed and execute effects, but by attaching it to a filler you press all the time, the bonuses are just added passively. The flow of spamming Fireball never gets disrupted by something more engaging. The only thing you have any agency over between Combustion's window, aside from the Hot Streak procs, is the returning Pyroclasm. While it is cool to bring Pyroblast into the rotation outside of Hot Streak and add some payoff for the extra tuning headroom given by Hot Streak's frequency reduction, this doesn't cover the gaping holes left behind by what was removed. With the rest of the toolkit's losses established, I have to talk about the most damning portion I've saved for the end, which is Combustion. Fire's cooldown has been a core high point of the spec for over a decade, and it's one that designers have consistently leaned into as a payoff point. Where it stands in the War Within is a cycling of instant casts to feed Hot Streak, feeling like a pyromaniac, but when you remove Phoenix Flames as a backup activator and Scorch as your last resort fast cast to maintain that machine gun pace, you end up with a hollow imitation. Fireball is slow, and Combustion now has much lower uptime, meaning any point where Fireblast runs out, which can still happen despite the laundry list of CDR effects, the flow is shattered. Once you start chipping away at that big payoff moment, then it makes the rest of the empty space between cooldowns feel even worse. Whenever there's been a problem with Fire in the past, the go-to solution has been finding a way to provide more time inside Combustion, because it's a defining high point that engages players in a unique way. Risking that in the conquest for unnecessary pruning to try and increase clarity when it was already there in the first place is a major mistake to me. The rash removal of buttons previously central to the gameplay experience leads to this anemic Midnight offering, with its laundry list of Fireblast uptime enhancers, Combustion talents split across 10 separate nodes, and anything left behind bolted onto the same 2 spells. Ultimately, what happened to Fire is a case of misdiagnosing the root issue and overcorrecting. It received the same Sledgehammer treatment that was applied to Enhancement, but there simply wasn't enough meat on the bones to survive that. It existed in the same sphere as Havoc and Feral, needing surgical fixes to tighten up an elaborate web of CDR that had knock-on effects tuning, but it didn't suffer from the problem of poor signposting and esoteric talent complexity. Fire could have had the same treatment as Havoc, having a couple of specific nodes adjusted and wholesale moved into Midnight, or it could have had the path of Feral, adjusting the key problem point of variable CDR being such an overwhelming tracking concern. Instead, abilities, talents, and procs that were entirely reasonable in the Midnight framework were taken out back, often replaced by things more complex at first glance than the original offerings. The removal of Scorch is a prime example of the systemic failings. It fell victim to the trap of chasing complexity reduction purely by measure of button count, regardless of how many superfluous interactions were required to get there, removing something that had every reason to remain. There's a good reason why Fire is so consistently trotted out as the example of how seemingly bad that pruning is by detractors. It's because it's the catastrophic exception that proves the rule. With the case studies under our belt then, what point am I making with this? I still think, with some hindsight, my decision to call out the ballooning complexity in May was correct, and I'm happy that Blizzard chose to act on this growing issue when the opportunity arose with the add-on removal. While this is a painful transition due to that decision, I do think the dev team did a very good job in the cases where they correctly diagnosed the key issues that created complexity and friction, and the game is moving towards a much healthier direction in terms of providing guardrails for players to naturally understand their spec's goals, which, in turn, means it's less of an unhealthy reliance on external sources. Hush whispers about the secret real way to play a spec is fun the first time, but eventually all it does is turn away players before they even get off the starting block, and I just don't think that's a good thing. However, the approach taken has to be the right one. Fire, and it's not the only one on the list, don't get me wrong, proves that if the wrong tool is used for the job, you can end up destroying what made the spec fun in the first place. My goal when raising this concern in May was not this. I wanted to see execution requirements and depth remain because that's what I enjoy, but make it honest and upfront about what was expected of a player when they open the door. Enhancement has proven that this is achievable, and both Havoc and Feral prove that the team is capable of identifying when a lighter touch is needed. If this can be achieved across the board, the positives are almost universal for the long-term health of the game and the enjoyability of specs at all levels of play. Importantly though, we cannot have specs designed in such a way that you lose sight of what made them fun in the first place. The correct frameworks for these reworks exist already, as established by Enhancement, Havoc, and Feral. Fire, on the other hand, shows just how wrong it can go when you lose sight of the engaging core of a spec. If the Midnight team can course correct on its misses before release, it has a real shot at delivering deep gameplay while actually managing to limit complexity in the space. If, however, specs like Fire ship as they are, it doesn't matter how accurately you diagnose the messy specs. Discourse has already shown that people will only remember the ones that got it wrong.